and welcome to our Love Your Lake, our LKO Love Your Lake. It's our second one, our monthly seminar series. My name is Kirsten, and if you didn't meet me last month, my name is Kirsten. I'm on behalf of the LKO board, we were really happy to bring these seminars to you, our LKO community. These seminars are meant to be informative and to bring communities together during these new and different times. And it's also obviously to help us learn and to help us protect and bring awareness about our beautiful lake. The evening will work sort of like this. Our guest speaker tonight, which you will hear more about a bit later, is Rebecca Osborne, and she's going to be speaking about the environmental threats to our lake and about our forest creatures. Then after Rebecca's finished her presentation, we as audience members will be able to ask Rebecca questions. Some people have sent in questions, so thank you for doing that. We'll answer those questions first. Then we'll go to our chat function. If you're using an iPad, at the top corner, there's 3 dots and you just press that and there's the word chat, and you can leave or put your question, type your question in, and we'll get to it, and Rebecca can answer it. If you're using an iPad, I think the functions are down below at the bottom part of your screen. So after Rebecca's finished, we'll be able to have a good conversation with Rebecca about questions and concerns. A reminder to everybody that the seminar is being recorded. And the only reason why is that we want to make it available to other people who are not able to be here tonight at this specific time. Our last seminar, which was presented by Terry Moore, will be uploaded to our website and on our YouTube channel soon. So stay tuned for that. So I think that's about it. As again, if everyone can just keep themselves muted, if we haven't automatically muted everybody, that would be great so that the sound comes through for Rebecca. I think we can get things started. So I wanted to introduce to you tonight Wendy Hampson, our LKO director who's in charge of membership, and she's going to introduce Rebecca tonight. So Wendy, over to you.
So Rebecca is a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, having graduated with her undergrad from the University of Waterloo in environmental science and ecology. She is presently doing her PhD thesis on how pollution affects our freshwater creatures, specializing in researching mollusks, and in brackets, those are clams, snails, and slugs. Rebecca grew up in Mississauga, but while cottaging in Haliburton County, she always loved being in and around the water. Her love of and interest in all things water stems from the Gull River. Part of every summer growing up was time spent attending Camp Madiba in West Guildford, where she was introduced to whitewater kayaking. She has spent many happy and thrilling hours running the rapids on the Gull and other waterways. Living on a lake as a child, she spent her summers clam diving and would collect buckets full of clams and put them back, of course. Little did she know that 15 years later, she would be working with mollusks like clams and snails as an aquatic biologist. Rebecca has worked at Environment and Climate Change Canada in both the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Department and the Aquatic Contaminants Research Division, as well as managing the Wildlife Monitoring Program for the Ontario Ministry of Transportation. Rebecca's work has been published in several academic journals in her field, most recently as lead investigator for transgenerational effects of copper on freshwater snails. As well, she has spoken at several conferences, including the Freshwater Mollusk Conservation Society in San Antonio, Texas, the London Malacological Society Conference in London, UK, and the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry in Toronto, where she was awarded Best Student Presentation for North America. Freshwater mollusks are of particular important canary in the coal mine for aquatic ecosystems, and Ontario is home to many endangered and important species of mollusks. Please welcome Rebecca Osborne speaking on Staying Alive, Environmental Threats to Our Lake and Forest Creatures. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, let me just share my screen. Thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, are we good to go? Good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to tell you all about uh, the different critters that you might encounter in Haliburton County. Um, I'm truly an aquatic biologist at heart because I just love looking at critters and collecting things. And I have my little box of mollusk mascots right here. So I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph. And this is a little bit of a mishmash of just some critters you might encounter and some of the threats that they're facing. And hopefully it's not as depressing as it sounds in the title, but maybe a few little ways we can help do our part to improve conditions for them. Okay. Oh, sorry, 1 second. My slides are not advancing. There we go. So like Wendy said, I did my undergrad at Waterloo in environmental science and ecology. And in that experience, I had lots of co-op opportunities with Environment Canada and the Ministry of Transportation. And those are some of the projects I'll talk to you about tonight. And I'm currently doing my PhD on multi-generational effects of contaminants in freshwater snails. And there's a picture of me on the Gull River in case you needed proof. Also, if you like science and snail content on the internet, I have a snail Instagram. So you can follow that if you're interested. As a little recap, when I talk about mollusks, that is actually a phylum of organisms, which includes the bivalves, which is anything with 2 shells, the gastropods like snails and slugs, and the cephalopods, which are octopus and squid. Obviously, cephalopods are marine only, but we have lots of freshwater bivalves and gastropods. So you've probably encountered mollusks in many, many different ways. Namely food. I'm sure many of you have tried some in one form or another, and actually humans have been eating mollusks for about as long as humans have been around. They're also really important for pearls. Pearls actually come from the inside layer of a freshwater clam. This shiny surface here is mother of pearl, and when an irritant gets in there, they make kind of like a blister around that irritant, and that turns into a pearl. In the 1800s, mollusks were really important for button making before we had synthetic button making. And so you can see in this image here, there's these circles that have been punched out and turned into buttons. And this actually decimated mollusk populations in the 1800s. And then we've only sort of recently seen the revival, but they're on the decline again because of our activities. You've probably heard about freshwater mollusks as invasive species like the zebra mussel. And this is a fun fact I learned last summer, but if you've ever heard of how purple was such a royal color because purple dye was very expensive, that's actually because the dye was fermented from thousands and thousands of marine snails. And it was very, very difficult and lengthy to make. So there you go, royal color because it was made from snails. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the concerns that I have that are especially relevant to Haliburton County, and then as well as some of the critters you might encounter, especially in, well, I found these particular ones that I'll show you in Kashag, but they'll be found anywhere in Haliburton and most of Ontario as well. Okay, so in November, I actually got to do a little bit of field work at Wendy's house, looking for some Chinese mystery snails. And so these are some of the other things I've found. I love just looking for animals and seeing what you can find. And there's so much more to the lake than meets the eye. So maybe this summer, if we're all stuck at home, you can do some citizen science from what you learn here. So the benthos or the benthic zone is basically anything that touches the sediment, including the shoreline. And these animals live either in the sediment or right at the top. And so that's kind of my area of expertise. And there is a huge diversity of what we can find there. So these are all things that you could find if you stepped into your lake and took a look really close at the benthic layer. So some of these include crustaceans, like this is the water flea, the Daphnia, and the Hyalella, which is a freshwater shrimp, as well as the crayfish, which I'm sure you've seen, leeches, which I'm sure you've encountered, and lots of tiny worms that live in the sediment. And they all are super important to the health of the sediment, which is the foundation layer for the food systems in our lakes. And then the other interesting creatures that we encounter are the terrestrial guys that lay their eggs in the water. And so these include things like dragonflies, mayflies, caddisflies. Caddisflies are my particular favorite, and you can look for these when you go out into your lake next. If you take a rock and flip it over, you'll see these little cocoons on the bottoms of rocks, and that's actually the home of a baby caddisfly. So the caddisfly babies, they'll take all the little bits that they can find around them, glue it around themselves, and live there for a few weeks until they're ready to emerge. And so it depends on what's on your lake, but they can be made out of larger rocks, pebbles, sand, pine needles, anything they can find. And a French artist, Hubert Duprat, actually did a little art experiment with these caddisflies and provided them only little gems to make their cocoons out of. So I thought that was really neat. And then this is kind of my domain, the freshwater mollusks. So we've got things like freshwater snails and mussels, and that's my hand because some mussels can get really big. And that's actually an Ontario mussel, so there you go. So these are the specific ones I found in Casheg when I did my little bit of field work. We have things like the Modus gyralis and the bellmouth ram's horn. Those are very classic. They'll be found anywhere in any kind of lake. This Modus gyralis is very tiny. These are millimeter indicators. And then the bottom three pictures are the banded mystery snail. So that's actually a type of invasive species that's related to the Chinese mystery snail. And we'll talk about invasive species in a little bit. And then I also found quite a few shells of freshwater clams. I'm sure many of you have seen freshwater clams in your lake. As Wendy mentioned, I remember we could collect bucketfuls off the end of our dock, and now there are so much fewer. So the Eastern Elliptio they'll be found everywhere. They are a very classic species. And then the giant floater is quite a large species that was never believed to be able to live this far north. But actually we're seeing it more and more. So we think that their range is expanding due to warming. So that's kind of interesting. Freshwater mussels are very, very, very important. And they're kind of an underdog that no one knows about. And before I did my study with my colleagues at Environment Canada, I did not know how important they were and how interesting they were. So an adult freshwater mussel can filter up to 40 liters of water a day. So they're really helping us out by keeping our water clean and filtering out all those particles. They also act as food for many organisms higher up the food web. So they are part of that cycle that keeps our lakes really healthy and clean. But interestingly, out of all of the animal species that have gone extinct, 42% of those were mollusks. And so they're disproportionately at risk of extinction compared to all other animals. In Canada, we actually have a major hotbed of mussel diversity compared to the rest of the world. We have 55 species of freshwater mussels, in Canada, and 41 of those are found in Ontario, especially around the GTA and Southern Ontario. And 15 of those are species at risk. So this kind of mussel, the unionids is what they're called, are really, really interesting because they have a very cool life cycle. They start out life as a little parasitic guy called a glaucidia. So this is a picture in my microscope. They basically are just two shells and one tiny little mussel that, like a little Pac-Man. And they don't have any other organs. And what they have to do to live and metamorphose into adults is snap onto the gills of a fish. This is a close-up picture of a fish gill. And so they clamp down onto the fish gill and get their nutrients by parasitizing the fish. And that's how they grow up. And so they have these very intimate connections with the fish populations, and both are really important to support each other. And what we notice is as soon as fish health starts to decline, the mussels are wiped out almost instantly, and they're unable to recruit to the next generation. So they're unable to have a new generation of babies successfully make it to adulthood. And this is a really big problem because some mussels can live up to 30 years. And so if you're not getting new babies, they're a very long-lived species and their populations won't be able to be sustained. So if you are inspired to do some citizen science, just a couple reminders, make sure you're always respectful and try to minimize handling the critters. If you found them under a rock, put the rock back first and then slide the critter next to it so that you don't accidentally squish it. And take lots of pictures. There are so many online resources that you can use to identify what you found, and share your science. I use iNaturalist all the time because I love seeing where other people have found different organisms. And then the other one I want to advertise a little bit is the Clam Counter app, which you can download. It was actually developed between the Toronto Zoo and my friends at Environment Canada, and they're using it to track mussel populations across Ontario. Okay, so invasive species. And in this picture, an invasive species and reeds, which I'm teasing myself here because this is actually a lot of Phragmites, which I'm sure you've heard of. But I just like to, whenever I talk about invasive species, I like to make a point of reminding myself that we're also a very invasive species. And when we think about the impacts that what we consider invasive species have, we also need to consider our own impacts and put that into context. So this is a picture of a Chinese mystery snail, which are a hot topic right now. So the problem with invasive species is that they often can outcompete native species. So if you think about an ecosystem as a business, these guys are usually bigger, faster, better at eating, bullies. They can just do the business of life a little bit better than the native species. And so then it's harder for those native species to do okay. They often can introduce diseases and parasites that are new to the native ecosystems and can threaten them. And often they can affect our industries, like they can collapse fisheries, they can affect manufacturing by clogging water intake pipes, and they can affect ecotourism by fouling different environments. But they're subject to bias. I get a little hesitant when I'm talking about invasive species because something that's non-native is not always invasive. Sometimes they can be really helpful. Earthworms were actually not a native species to the North America. Excuse me. So it's just important to put it into context instead of kind of victimizing these invasive species all the time right off the bat just because they're not native. And things change. So as climate change is occurring, we're seeing massive range shifts. So species are able to live in places where they never could live before. And it's not always going to be all bad. Oops, got ahead of myself there. So these are some invasive species that you've probably heard about. I won't go into too much depth on these ones, but just to keep an eye out, there are often programs for many of these species to report. So if you're interested, you can look into learning to identify the signs of them and reporting them because that really helps scientists keep track of where things are moving. So the emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle, they primarily affect trees. Phragmites is a type of reed. There are some native versions and some non-native versions, but the problem with them is if they get into a wetland and establish themselves, they can actually suck a wetland dry. Zebra mussels, that picture is really interesting. They've actually found that not only do they outcompete native mussels, but they can actually adhere to the mussel themselves and they can't open anymore to feed. So that's what's happening in that picture. And then of course, the Chinese mystery snail. So the two big ones I'll talk about briefly here are the Chinese mystery snail and the banded mystery snail. I did actually find the banded mystery snail in Halls Lake and Kashag so far. Those are the only two lakes I've really looked at. But so they're definitely there. I haven't seen Chinese mystery snails that far north yet, but I know that they're around. I've heard lots of people talk about them. So the main problem with these two is that they do outcompete native species, and they can be an introduction of parasites. So mostly in North America, parasites from snails are not really anything to worry about too much. In tropical areas, there are parasites that can be quite dangerous and life-threatening to humans. Up here, because it's so much colder, the types of parasites that snails can pass along that are affecting humans are typically more like something that will be like a minor irritant, like swimmer's itch. So it's not pleasant, but it's not life-threatening. So I just didn't want to say parasites and scare everyone. But that is something we are kind of concerned about, that as climate change is occurring and warming, we may see more and more dangerous parasites. And that's one reason that it's a little bit worrying that snail populations are moving farther north with these invasive types. So on that note, one of the other examples that I have is the caribou brain parasite. So snails are hosts often for many types of parasites, but like I said, the ones in North America are usually pretty benign. So with the warmer temperatures, we're seeing these snails be able to move their ranges much farther north, and with that comes the parasites, which also can increase how many parasites each individual organism has. So caribou are susceptible to a brainworm that is transmitted by snails and slugs. And so the problem is this can actually end up in the meat. And we've seen some studies. One of my professors from undergrad, she worked with a lot of indigenous communities, and they were really concerned that their like subsistence hunting meat supply was going to be affected. And so this is the kind of thing that we'll see worsen with climate change, just because snails are able to live farther north, which we've never seen before. So this is a little bit of a warning. There's some parasite pictures coming up. They're not too graphic, but just be warned. So these are actually some that I collected. I had someone contact me. They were concerned about their family getting swimmer's itch, and they were asking me, you know, does that have to do with snails? And I said, yep, usually the snails are one of the hosts. And so I went and did some field work. I also got swimmer's itch, so now I've had the lived experience. And so these little white strings are the parasites coming out of the snails I collected from this lake. So I am able to find parasites in a snail, but the main thing that's happening here is when they leave the snail, they're actually trying to find a duck host or a bird host, but they're attracted to warmth and chemical cues that we're giving off. So they can't infect you, they can't enter your bloodstream or anything like that. What happens is they try to burrow into the skin and they cause like a little pimple, an irritation in the skin, and it's very itchy, but it's not like getting into your body or anything scary like that. So it's uncomfortable, but it's not life-threatening. But it is kind of a concern because these we'll see increasing cases, and we already have. And then also increased shoreline development is a really big problem because waterfowl are able to congregate more in areas that are not developed. So like lawns leading right up to the lake edge. And this increases human waterfowl interactions. And that's the real kind of trigger for this, because I don't want you to think snails are bad because of the parasites. And so this is a little video of one of the parasites I got just because it's kind of neat and kind of gross. But this is under a microscope in my lab. So they kind of just swim around. They're a type of nematode, I believe. And yeah, so one of the best things you can do is not feed the waterfowl, maintain your naturalized shoreline. You can also, for just invasive species in general, learning to identify them and report them. And if you're moving a boat or any kind of equipment between bodies of water, make sure you inspect them and clean them really well. And this will help prevent transferring invasive species between water bodies. Okay, so then the next sort of big concern that I have is road salt. I know that sand is more used in Haliburton County, but we do still sometimes use road salt, I believe. And it's definitely a bigger problem for where I am in Guelph in Southern Ontario. So we actually use a lot of road salt in Canada, which we have to because icy roads are very dangerous. So it's estimated that in 2009, 7 million tons of road salt were applied in Canada, and Toronto applies about 130,000 tons a year just on its own. So this acronym is the Provincial Water Quality Monitoring Network, and they just monitor levels of different contaminants in rivers across Ontario, and they've seen a 70% increase in chloride, so like sodium chloride of salt, the chloride part, between 1998 and 2005. And most freshwater organisms are very, very sensitive to salt. So if you think about how we cure meat in salt, that's because the salt draws all that water out of the meat to preserve it. Something very similar is happening all the time in our bodies, in our tissues, in lakes and rivers. So animals are always trying to maintain a balance between salt concentration and water concentration. And so if the water around them is getting saltier, that's going to draw water out from their body, and they're going to struggle to not dehydrate even though they're living in the water. So freshwater organisms are really bad at regulating that because they usually don't have to. So as the freshwater gets saltier, they're going to be in really big trouble compared to any other organism. So unfortunately, where our road salt use is the highest, so is our diversity of freshwater mussels. We have the most freshwater mussels in the same area that we're using the most road salt, and freshwater mussels are even more sensitive to salt than any other aquatic organism. So actually right there in that darkest red patch in Southern Ontario around the GTA is where we find 35 of 55 of our species of mussels that are found in Canada. So it's definitely very concerning because, as I mentioned, most of these freshwater species really struggle with changing salt levels. And salt kills that baby stage of the freshwater mussels, the Glaucidia, because they can't close properly anymore. And if they can't close, they can't latch onto a fish. And then that's their whole recruitment gone. They're not unable to complete their life cycle and mature to adults. And unfortunately, we're also seeing that road salt is leading to permanent salinization. So in the past, when we've monitored road salt levels, we'll see, during a spring melt event, the concentration massively increases and then goes back down. And now we're seeing it's not rebounding as well as it used to. So we're starting to see that long-term effect. And this actually means that it could end up infiltrating into groundwater, which would affect our freshwater supply. But when we make guidelines, so some of my colleagues are actually on a panel for freshwater salinization, and they're trying to come up with guidelines for how much salt should be allowed to be used every year, while safely still keeping the roads ice-free. But basically, they're actually going to highlight mussels as the star of that because they're the most sensitive. And so if we make regulations based on the most sensitive species, then everybody else will be protected by those regulations. So that's kind of mussels getting their moment of fame. So a few ways you can help, although obviously this is more of like a municipal issue with road salt. But if you can use sand instead of salt, use only as much as you need to melt the area. And then things that you might not expect, but maintaining a naturalized shoreline actually really helps because it creates a riparian buffer zone, which actually allows contaminants to filter out as that water passes over it instead of dumping directly into the water. And then these last couple pieces are not necessarily just for salt, but kind of good runoff practices. If you have large piles of salt or sand or other materials, try to tarp them, because then if it rains, they won't flush directly into the water. Try to avoid fertilizing your garden right before significant rain. So again, it's not getting dumped right into the waterway. And try to keep your septic in good condition to prevent any leaching of things that we don't want into the lake. Okay, and then on that note of things in the lake that we don't want, wastewater treatment. So again, this is maybe not as prevalent because I don't think Haliburton has any massive wastewater treatment plants. I think this one's the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant on the Grand River, but it's still relevant, and a lot of the topics are still the same. So the issue that we're finding with wastewater treatment is that a lot of people make a lot of waste and it's very hard to clean up. So the Great Lakes actually provide water for nearly 30 million people. But unfortunately, we can actually detect pharmaceuticals in the Great Lakes water and surface water tributaries because of wastewater effluent. So once you flush your toilet, it gets treated and cleaned and put back into the water. But most wastewater treatment plants are actually not very good at filtering many of these chemicals out. So this is just a handful of some of the ones that you can find if you just take a sample of water from the Great Lakes. So commonly stuff like acetaminophen, ibuprofen, caffeine we can measure at quite high levels in the water, diabetes medication like metformin, a few different antibiotics, BPA, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. That's a component of plastic. So all of these are detectable because of what's called PPCPs, which are pharmaceuticals and personal care products. It's kind of just a big catch-all term for stuff we use every day that ends up in the water. And unfortunately, we're starting to see effects in the animals. So this is a little study done by one of my colleagues at Environment Canada. We had, she measured mussel diversity at a few different spots along the river. So the blue arrow is the river's progression, and the red line is where there was a large urban area. And these are all the different types of mussels she could find. So if you can see at the upstream sites before the urban area, we had lots of individuals found, as well as lots of different types of individuals. So the more bars were the more number of species, and the higher the bars, the more individuals of that species. And then as soon as we get downstream within the urban area and farther downstream, we see much fewer bars. So we had reduced species diversity, so the number of different species. We also had reduced species richness, which was the number of individuals. So we have fewer types and fewer in general, as soon as you get downstream of that urban area. So our effluent is causing die-off zones for our freshwater mussels. We also have a colleague at the University of Waterloo, Mark Servos, who found intersex fish directly related to wastewater effluent. So this is because of higher levels of estrogen ending up in the water from wastewater treatment plants. So this is the inside of a fish. The long white things here are the testicles, but the testicles were growing eggs because of the estrogen levels in the water. They had become feminized. So this is a really big problem for population health and the sustainability of our fish populations. But interestingly, as soon as the wastewater treatment plant upgraded from, I think it's like a phase 2 to a phase 3, the fish went back to normal and the sex ratios evened out. So upgrading our wastewater treatment plants actually makes a big difference. And then another really big one that I'll just talk about quickly is the SSRIs, or the antidepressants, that class of antidepressants. We can actually detect them often in the wastewater as well. And they have a pretty considerable influence on survival and growth of many freshwater species. So this is a study that I'm working on right now in my lab. Each of these little wells had one egg mass from a snail. So snails lay their eggs in big clumps that are all glued together. That's an egg mass. And then they can develop within sort of 7 to 10 days. And we put them with different concentrations of Cipralex, which is a type of antidepressant. It's very similar to like Zoloft or Prozac. And so this first set here is our control. They were exposed to just plain water, and they all developed and hatched. Those tiny little brown dots are all little baby snails. But then at our higher concentrations, we don't really see those brown dots because they didn't really develop, and they didn't develop at all in the highest, and they didn't hatch. So we're seeing no more development because of exposure. And just for some context, a typical human dose is sort of anywhere from 20 to 50 milligrams. So these are at concentrations that we actually could be seeing in the water. And this is a little bit of a close-up. These are the little baby snails developing in the controls by day 7, and no development at our highest concentration. So this is kind of worrying for population development, especially because snails typically only lay eggs once a year. So if they laid eggs once a year and there was some kind of contaminant that stopped them from developing, you'd get no new snails for that year, which would really hit their population quite hard. Okay, so then this is just a little bit of a summary. We see that feminization of fish, changes to reproduction affecting the population. And then a couple really interesting behavioral things have been seen with with antidepressants. So it can change their aggression level, it can change their food patterns, and it can even affect their interactions with predators. So there was a study that found they were a lot more bold around predators, which means they're more likely to get eaten because of antidepressants. So a few things you can do to help. Make sure you follow the directions on your medication carefully. Don't throw medication down the toilet. And wastewater treatment, it's actually not regulated at a provincial or federal level, which is unfortunate. So it's really down to the municipality when they make an upgrade. So if you're really interested, you can ask your municipality what can be done to do an upgrade, because that makes quite a difference. Okay, and this one's my favorite one. I'm rushing a little bit, sorry, I'm close to time. But so reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. This is a big hot topic for you guys, I know. It's estimated that 14,000 wildlife vehicle collisions happen in Ontario per year, with 600 of them resulting in serious injuries. And in the US, these collisions are estimated to cost $8.4 million in damages a year. And then this one estimate I found suggested that up to 10% of your car insurance cost might be attributable to wildlife vehicle collisions. And the MTO reported that 30% of their annual collisions occur in the northeastern region, which includes Haliburton County. So when I worked there a few summers ago, I was part of the Provincial Highways Management Department. And so we were responsible for the follow-up after they had done some road construction projects throughout Ontario. And they had installed wildlife overpasses and underpasses, and we were trying to monitor how effective they were. So I worked on these two that were farther south, but they also actually did one near Sudbury and one near North Bay. The two I worked on were the 404 extension, which you may have driven to get to your cottage, and Highway 26 through Collingwood. So this is a little schematic of what was done at Collingwood. They added these two underpasses for the deer because they knew there was a really significant deer population in the area already, and they were worried about collisions. And then the other feature they added was deer escape ramps. So the idea is that they can't jump up onto this ramp, but if they get on the roadway somehow, they can walk up and down, but can't get back on. And so our job was to monitor to see if it was actually effective, because if it was, we could provide evidence to the government to include these features in their future projects. And the good news is they worked, so that's really exciting. Definitely a little bit of a win. So this is a deer jumping down. This is the deer's belly and her legs off our escape ramp. And so we found that over the 2 to 3 year acclimation period that we monitored using trail cameras, there was a 95 to 97% success rate. So the camera would be triggered when an animal approached, and then we would watch a few frames later to see if they used it or not. And they weren't really happy with them the first year, but by year 3, they were very successful. And we actually were able to follow up and found a reduction in the collisions for those areas and less carcass pickups. So they seem to be working in terms of decreasing collisions as well. And then this is really just an excuse to show you cute animal pictures, but these are some of my favorites that I found throughout my summer of going through pictures. Because the cameras were triggered by infrared, like movement across infrared, animals actually can see infrared. And so a lot of them were very, very curious about it. This is a little porcupine trying to use an underpass and a curious raccoon and some baby deer near one of the underpasses. This is Highway 26 near Collingwood, and it just kind of blew my mind. The road is right at the top of that ridge, and you'd never know. This was just in the middle of the day. There were always deer around, and I feel like you'd never know if you were driving on the road. A little family of raccoons happened in the summer, and we had quite a lot of coyotes and coy wolves. A very curious deer selfie. Some baby coyote pups. Another little raccoon. A nice family of ducks. And a beautiful heron. And so that was, I got to spend my summer looking at great pictures of animals. So, but also what a win to have decreased collisions. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a little bit about critters and some of the good things we're doing and things we can do to improve. And I would just like to give a little bit of acknowledgement to my supervisor, Dr. Ryan Prosser, my colleagues, Dr. Patricia Gillis and Dr. Ev Gilroy, my lab and my students, as well as funding from the Government of Ontario and CERC and Health Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was awesome. A really helpful and easy way of understanding what's going on in our lake from a critter point of view. I'm going to go right now to the questions that were sent to us. So thank you, Jan, for putting them in the chat function. I'm just going to go through them. You may have already talked about some of this, but someone sent in, we see freshwater clams in our shallow bay every year. We are told not to dare eating them, but don't know if they're harmful or helpful or benign.
Yeah, definitely don't eat them. I have never tried it, but I have colleagues who have, and apparently they just taste like shoe leather and mud. So wouldn't recommend.
Okay.
But mostly they're very helpful. If you have zebra mussels, that's the only exception, but I don't think I've seen reports of them getting into Haliburton yet. I know they've been in Georgian Bay, but yeah, everything else, all the other mussels are very, very helpful and good for our lakes.
Okay, good. Okay, good to know. Another question from the same person. I think, and you mentioned a bit about this, we never use any fertilization or weed killer on our lawns, but there are some areas that could use more nutrients than other areas, and other areas have more weeds. Are there any non-harmful methods to feed a lawn or kill weeds?
Yes and no. So nutrients are not always bad. In fact, just like our bodies, the lakes need a certain amount of nutrients. The issue is they end up being over fertilized a lot of the time. That's how we get like algal blooms. And so I would probably say moderation is really good if you're trying to decide to fertilize your lawn. Also avoiding right before big rain events where they could run off. And then in terms of weed killer, I think there are probably some non-harmful brands, but the main one from kind of a toxicology perspective has to do with specificity. So if you heard about the neonics pesticides with the bees, the problem was they were very, very targeted to insects, which became indiscriminate about good insects and bad insects. So finding something that doesn't affect non-target organisms. So if it were to run off into the lake, it wouldn't affect the lake ecosystem and those critters, then that one isn't really as much of a concern.
Okay. Okay, good to know. That's helpful. Another one is our lake has power boats usage and lots of Phillips, obviously, at the marina. How harmful is small amounts of oil and gas seepage into the lake? And another question sort of similar to that is that, or from the boat cleaning products that people use to clean their boats?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly, like best practice would be to avoid as much as possible getting anything like
Yeah.
that into the lake. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but lakes have a certain amount of resiliency, but the problem is the more we develop, the more their ability to respond to what we throw at them decreases. So really it'd be best if we could keep that out of it. I feel like if you drop a little bit, you don't have to go home feeling guilty, but
Yeah.
but yeah, it's best to just be careful.
Yeah, no, for sure. We are, for everyone out there, we are having another speaker, and there's some of these questions that people have sent in that I think I'm going to leave because I think they're more related to for next month's Love Your Lake. So make sure you tune into that for some of the people. There's one person that said, one of our lakes had algae bloom this year. The ministry said it was non-toxic. Many people are living or spending longer periods of time at their cottage and have installed washing machines, dishwashers. Although our septic systems have been inspected, could the increase of people living on these tiny lakes be connected to algae blooms? Would you know that?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of just, unfortunately, the more we develop areas, the more vulnerable different things are to things like algal blooms. But also it's kind of funny because certain areas, algal blooms are actually really healthy sometimes. So it's not very appealing physically for us, but they're actually really, really good for the lake sometimes. Not the toxic ones, those are not great.
Yes.
But it's part of the cycle. So I wouldn't worry about it. I know it's a little unsightly, but they're nothing really to be worried about. But definitely more human activity does increase the likelihood, especially phosphorus is the big one, the big nutrient that does that.
Cool. One other question was for clams. Are there specific fish that they prefer to latch onto that you talked about?
Yeah,
specific ones?
So some species are actually so highly adapted, they only work with one species of fish, and they're very vulnerable to those fish collapsing. There are a couple species, you can look this up on YouTube, it's pretty neat, but they've evolved so that their gills, when they poke them out through the shell, look quite like minnows. And so they'll like flick them around and look like minnows so that a fish comes along and goes right up to it. So there's a bigger chance of their babies getting on the gills.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Very neat.
Pretty special adaptations in those guys.
Yeah, I'll say. Someone is asking, what is your snail Instagram handle?
It's Snail Queen 27.
Snail Queen 27, everybody. Look it up on Instagram, start following Rebecca. Are there any other questions that people might have for Rebecca about the creatures that are in our lake? There's one, obviously we talked a bit about the general cleaners and detergents that might be labeled as environmentally friendly or green. What should we look at the label to tell us if these cleaners are safe to use near the cottage or the lake, or could it go down the drain? Is there anything that you know about certain cleaners?
I don't know a ton about specifics of cleaners,
Yeah.
but I really respect, if you're doing your research and looking, there's lots of information out there about different types of chemicals and what's, harmful and what's not. So it definitely helps to do your research. I don't know specifics though, unfortunately.
Okay. There's a question, is there any way to get the invasive snails out of the lake? I know that we as an LKO, people can actually become trained in looking for the Chinese mystery snails. I know there's a few people that have signed up. We've sent information about that out to people so that they can become trained Chinese mystery snails finders, I guess, for another word. But I don't know if you know of any way that we can get rid of those.
It's really tricky, yeah, because so the problem is there are some very good molluscicides or insecticides for mollusks, but they're targeted to mollusks, which means they will kill the invasive species, but they'll kill all the good ones too. And we can't really separate, because when we make something targeted to those organisms, it's very effective, but we can't pick and choose which species. So that's one of the tricky parts about invasive species, is it's hard to get rid of them without hurting the native species too.
Yeah. And for those that are, thank you. If there's anybody watching now that is part of that training session, I know Glenda, I think you might be doing it, and a few other people from the board might be a part of that training session. So we will give you information about that. So stay tuned more about that topic for the Chinese mystery snails. Another question that's coming through is, are ducks and Canada geese harmful to the water?
Not on their own, but as we're seeing higher shoreline development and interaction between humans and waterfowl, there is actually the potential for increased parasites like the swimmer's itch parasite, increased E. coli, things like that, because where there are a lot of ducks and geese, there's a lot of duck and geese poo, which I'm sure many of you have encountered at your lakes. So yeah, yes and no, not on their own, but again, the more and more we develop, the more likely they are to come into those spaces.
So protecting that shoreline and making it so that there's not the grass, so that, because geese like to see the water. So
exactly.
Right. So making it more of an environmentally friendly one would be beneficial for that. Let's just see if there's any more questions out there for anybody. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them through the chat function.
Kirsten,
yes.
Kirsten, Kathy accidentally sent me her question, and so maybe Kathy, you can you can unmute yourself and ask directly.
Oh, my apologies. It was to do with the fact that when I was growing up way back in the 1950s and 60s, the bottom of the lake close to shore was quite nice and sandy, wonderful for swimming in. Now it's very muddy and gooey. So back in the 50s, there were lots of clams and lots of snails too. And it was wonderful to see all their tracks in the morning. And now there's virtually none, no clams anyways, except the odd one you're lucky to find close to shore where the waves are keeping it sandy. So I was wondering whether that's the reason why they're not there anymore, or is it because the fish that are their hosts are gone? And if so, what kind of fish has gone?
I would definitely say it's probably more water quality and the bottom sediment changing. A lot of mussels are really particular about what the sediment they like is, and many of them are actually specially designed for some of those. So I can actually kind of show you. This is an example of one that's meant for deeper sediment because it's very thick. And then there are others that are very thin-shelled. And so they're actually more likely to live in very fine silty sediment because they can float within the sediment a little bit better. So they're very specially adapted to those benthic environments. So I think probably the change in lake bottom But a lot of the time, I think in Halliburton, many of the common species use a few different types of fish, but one of them is the largemouth bass, I believe. That's a very common host species for freshwater mussels. But I'm not sure what the fish population is like in Kashag. I don't know.
Interesting.
I have a follow-up question to that then. Would you recommend, or is it a good idea or not a good idea to maybe try to change or rake out the
Your sandy bottom.
yeah, to reclaim that sandy bottom? Is that a good idea or not a good idea?
I don't know. I'd be kind of hesitant to recommend that, because I don't know. I just feel like whenever we feel like we're doing something good and we intervene, it kind of backfires. But yeah, it's really hard to say. I think the big one would be, to me, prevention rather than trying to intervene in that way. So a lot of extra sediment will come from erosion. So again, that naturalized shoreline or river rock or some kind of thing to prevent erosion, tarping large piles at construction sites. That's where a lot of that sediment will be coming from, which can also affect the water quality, making it very turbulent. Yeah. There's a word for that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. I think we have time for a couple more questions. One question that just come through, Rebecca, is it says, this past late winter, we noticed an opening in the ice with a pile of bottom detritus and clamshells around the opening. Is that the action of otters?
Oh, probably. Yeah. They like clams. That's one of their big predators. And I'm pretty sure they'll like put a rock on their stomach and smash the clamshell on their rock on their stomach to eat it. So pretty clever.
So there you go. So there you go. The answer to that. Yeah, I don't know if there's any more questions out there for Rebecca. I've learned a lot tonight, and I hope everybody out there has. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, if there isn't any other questions, I'm gonna let Wendy say a few words.
Rebecca, thank you so much for helping us out with all that new information. It gives me another good reason not to take too much Tylenol and not to drink too much coffee, and knowing that I'm going to muck up the mollusks out there. And now I have another reason to talk to Bob about upgrading the wastewater treatment plant, although that's in Halliburton, and about reducing the amount of salt that's on our roads. And I too, like Kathy, our cottages are right beside each other, and I remember too the many summers collecting clams, and now, as Kathy said, to see one and its trail in the sand in the morning is like, whoa, it's a banner day, everybody come take a look, this is wonderful. But yeah, so you don't see it very often any longer. And now every time I wear my purple turtleneck and wear my pearls, I'll think of where they came from. So thank you very much. And this will be coming in the mail to you.
The virtual envelope.
Soon, the virtual envelope. Right now it's kind of empty, but to be filled.
Oh, don't tell her that. Don't tell her that.
So thank you very much, Rebecca, for your time. Very, very enjoyable.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was really enjoyable. Everyone give her a round of applause. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Everyone's clapping for you. It was really enjoyable. I learned a ton. And thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. We always like to keep our seminars for an hour of your time because we know time is precious. And we hope that you found it helpful. We want to remind you that our next Love Your Lake seminar will take place on May the 18th. At the same time, 7:30, and our guest speaker at that time will be Dr. Norman Yan, and he'll be talking about protecting our lakes forever, moving from rehabilitation to protection during a time of climate change. And I think some of the questions that came out, that came through the chat function that we didn't address, we will talk about at that time as well. Don't forget to register for these workshops. through our website as you've done this time, so you can receive the important information about the seminar. And thank you very much. Judy's just saying really informative and fun. Thank you so much. And we thank everybody for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you our next one. Just so that you know, we are doing a couple of kids ones as well that'll be pre-recorded. So those will be up on our website as well. But we hope that you're enjoying these times together. We hope that everybody stays safe, stays healthy, kind to one another, and have a wonderful night. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month, May the 18th. Bye from now. Take care, everybody. Thanks again, Rebecca.